You already know how this story ends. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar walked into the Theatre of Pompey in Rome and was stabbed 23 times by men he trusted. You know the name Brutus. You probably know the line, even if Shakespeare invented it. Et tu, Brute. And you too, Brutus. That moment has been told and retold for 2,000 years in plays, films, paintings, and history books. But here is what nobody tells you. The stabbing is not the interesting part. The interesting part is everything that came before it. The years of friendship, the debts repaid, the loyalty shown, the moment Brutus made his decision and why. Because this is not simply a story about assassination. This is a story about what happens when a man loves his country more than he loves the person who saved his life. This is the story of the most famous betrayal in human history. And the truth is far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than anything Hollywood ever showed you. Before we talk about the assassination, we need to understand Marcus Junius Brutus. Because the way history remembers him depends entirely on who is telling the story. To Caesar's supporters, he was the ultimate traitor, a man who stabbed his patron, his protector, possibly even his father figure, in the back after years of receiving nothing but generosity and trust. To the Roman Senate and the Republican traditionalists, he was the savior of Rome, a man who made the hardest possible decision to protect the Republic from becoming a monarchy. Both of these portraits are true simultaneously. And that tension is exactly what makes Brutus the most psychologically fascinating figure in all of ancient history. Brutus came from one of Rome's most legendary families. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had founded the Roman Republic 5 centuries earlier by expelling the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus. That founding story was not just family history for Marcus Brutus. It was identity. It was responsibility. It was the weight of a name that meant something specific in Roman culture. The name of the man who decided that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. Growing up with that ancestry meant growing up with a particular understanding of what betraying the Republic would mean. Not just politically, personally, existentially. Brutus was also genuinely brilliant. He studied philosophy deeply, particularly Stoicism, the school of thought that emphasized duty, reason, and the subordination of personal feeling to moral obligation. He wrote philosophical texts. He corresponded with Cicero, the greatest intellectual of the age, who considered Brutus one of the finest minds in Rome. He was not a soldier primarily, not a political schemer primarily. He was a thinker who had ended up in the middle of the most dangerous political moment in Roman history. His relationship with Caesar was layered and complicated in ways that ancient sources hint at but never fully explain. Caesar and Brutus's mother Servilia had a long and intimate relationship. Some ancient historians suggest Caesar may have genuinely believed he was Brutus's father, though this is historically disputed. What is not disputed is that Caesar treated Brutus with extraordinary personal warmth and political generosity throughout his career. When Brutus made the catastrophic political decision to side with Pompey against Caesar during the Civil War, Caesar gave explicit orders that Brutus was not to be harmed. Find him. Bring him to me safely. That order, in the middle of a brutal civil war where men were killed daily for lesser offenses against Caesar, tells you everything about how Caesar felt about Brutus personally. After Caesar won the civil war and became dictator, he appointed Brutus to significant positions of power and influence. He made him governor of Cisalpine Gaul. He marked him for the position of urban praetor. He publicly and repeatedly demonstrated trust in a man who had literally fought against him with weapons in hand just years earlier. To Caesar, Brutus was someone worth forgiving completely and trusting completely. That was not political calculation. That was genuine personal feeling from one of the most calculating political minds Rome ever produced. And Brutus knew all of this. He was not confused about what Caesar had done for him. He was not ignorant of the debt he owed. What tormented Brutus was not uncertainty about Caesar's generosity. It was the question of whether that generosity, multiplied 1,000 times over, could ever outweigh what he saw happening to Rome itself. To understand why Brutus made the decision he made, You have to understand what Julius Caesar actually was by 44 BC. Because the Caesar that Brutus was watching in those final months was not simply a successful general or a popular politician. He was something Rome had not seen in 5 centuries. Something the Roman constitution had no language for. Something that made men like Brutus lie awake at night thinking about their ancestor who had driven out the last king. Caesar had been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, not a temporary emergency appointment, which was the traditional Roman use of the dictatorship, but a permanent, lifetime position with essentially unlimited power. He controlled the army. He controlled appointments to every significant political office. He controlled foreign policy, domestic policy, the treasury. The Senate still met. Elections still technically happened. But everyone in Rome understood that these institutions were now theater. The real decisions were made by one man. Caesar was also accumulating honors that Romans associated specifically with monarchy and divinity. His image was placed on Roman coins, something no living Roman had ever done before. A month was renamed in his honor, July, which we still use today. He was given the right to wear the purple toga of the ancient Roman kings on public occasions. Priests were appointed specifically to worship him as a living deity. A golden throne was placed in the Senate for him to sit upon. One by one, month by month, the symbols and substance of kingship were being draped around Julius Caesar while the Roman Republic watched and did nothing. Brutus watched all of this with growing horror. He was not alone. A significant portion of the Roman Senate shared his alarm. Men who had fought alongside Caesar, men who had benefited from Caesar's victories, men who personally liked Caesar as a human being. They were all watching the same thing and asking the same question. Was this still a republic? Or had it already become something else while they were not paying attention? The conspiracy that formed around Brutus and his brother-in-law Cassius was not a small group of bitter political losers. It eventually included somewhere between 60 and 80 senators, a substantial fraction of the entire Roman Senate. These were not marginal figures. These were established, respected men who had concluded that the republic they served no longer existed in any meaningful sense, and that only one action could restore it. Cassius was the driving organizational force behind the conspiracy. He was harder, more pragmatic, more politically ruthless than Brutus. He had real personal grievances against Caesar alongside his political ones. But Cassius understood something crucial. The assassination would only have historical legitimacy if Brutus was part of it. Because Brutus's name meant something. Because Brutus's reputation for personal honor and philosophical integrity was unimpeachable. Because if Marcus Junius Brutus, the man Caesar trusted most, concluded that Caesar had to die, then the act could be framed as a moral necessity rather than a political murder. Brutus was not recruited to the conspiracy because he was useful. He was recruited because without him, the whole thing was just crime. The pressure on Brutus in the weeks before the assassination was extraordinary. Cassius was working on him consistently, making arguments, presenting evidence, appealing to his philosophical principles and his family legacy. Anonymous notes began appearing on Brutus's magistrate's chair in the morning, messages from unknown Romans urging him to remember his ancestor, to remember what the name Brutus meant, to act. Whether these were spontaneous expressions of genuine popular feeling or orchestrated by Cassius to manipulate Brutus is still debated by historians. Either way, they worked on him. Brutus's wife Portia knew something was wrong. She could see it in how he was sleeping, how he was eating, how he would sit in silence for long periods staring at nothing. She confronted him directly and demanded he tell her what was happening. When he hesitated, she took a knife and stabbed herself in the thigh to demonstrate that she was strong enough to share his secret and keep it. Brutus was reportedly overwhelmed by this act and told her everything. That detail, preserved in ancient sources, tells you something important about the psychological weight Brutus was carrying. This was not a man who had made his decision lightly and was moving forward with cold confidence. This was a man being torn apart. The philosophical framework Brutus used to make his final decision is important to understand. As a Stoic, he believed that personal loyalty, while real and valuable, was ultimately subordinate to duty. The highest duty was not to a friend or a patron or even a family member. The highest duty was to virtue, to the common good, to the principles that made civilization possible. Caesar had been his friend. Caesar had saved his life and advanced his career. All of that was real. But if Caesar's continued existence meant the permanent end of the Roman Republic, the system of shared governance and rule of law that Brutus believed was the foundation of everything Rome had achieved, then personal loyalty had to yield to something larger. He also convinced himself, and this is crucial, that Caesar's death would automatically restore the Republic, that the Roman people would see the assassination as liberation and respond with gratitude, that the institutions of republican government would simply resume functioning once the dictator was removed. This belief, which turned out to be catastrophically wrong, was the central miscalculation of Brutus's life. He was a philosopher making a political decision, and his philosophical framework blinded him to the political realities that a harder, more cynical man like Cassius understood much better. There is one more thing about this period that almost no History Channel ever discusses. Caesar was warned. Repeatedly. Multiple people tried to tell him that a conspiracy existed. A philosopher named Artemidorus prepared a written note listing the names of the conspirators and tried to hand it to Caesar as he walked to the Senate on the Ides of March. Caesar received the note but did not read it. He kept being interrupted by other people pressing their own petitions into his hands as he walked. The note was still clutched unread in his hand when the daggers came out. His wife Calpurnia had terrible nightmares the night before and begged him not to go to the Senate. Caesar initially agreed to stay home. Then Decimus Brutus, another conspirator, not Marcus Brutus, went to Caesar's house personally and talked him out of it. He told Caesar that the Senate was planning to offer him the title of king over the eastern provinces that very day, and that if he did not show up, they might change their minds. Caesar's desire for that title, the one thing he wanted that kept being dangled and withheld, got him out of his house and into the Senate. He walked past Spurina, a soothsayer who had warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. Caesar reportedly said to him, "The Ides of March have come," meaning the day was here and nothing bad had happened yet. Spurina's response has been preserved for 2,000 years. He said, "Yes, they have come, but they have not yet gone." Caesar walked on. He had perhaps 30 minutes left to live. And somewhere inside the Theatre of Pompey, Marcus Junius Brutus was standing with a knife under his toga, running through his philosophical arguments one final time, trying to be certain he was doing the right thing. The 15th of March, 44 BC. Caesar arrives at the Theatre of Pompey where the Senate is temporarily meeting while the main Senate house is under renovation. The conspirators are already inside, positioned carefully around the room. They had agreed on one absolute rule. No one outside the conspiracy was to be harmed. This was to be a surgical removal of a tyrant, not a massacre. When Caesar's close ally Mark Antony was pulled aside at the entrance by a conspirator who engaged him in a long conversation specifically to keep him out of the room, the plan was working exactly as designed. Caesar sat on his golden chair. A senator named Tullius Cimber approached him with a petition to recall his exiled brother. Caesar had refused this petition before and began declining again. But Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down off his shoulder. This was the signal. Casca, standing directly behind Caesar, struck first with his dagger, hitting Caesar in the neck or shoulder. The blow was not clean, and Caesar grabbed Casca's arm and reportedly said in Greek, roughly, "What are you doing?" Then every conspirator in the room was moving. 23 stab wounds. That is what the ancient sources record. In the chaos of 60 men crowded around one man with knives, many of the conspirators accidentally cut each other. The strikes were not coordinated or precise. Some wounds were superficial. Some were deep. Caesar tried to defend himself initially, pulling his toga over his face at some point, though whether this was to preserve his dignity in death or because he could no longer see is not clear from the sources. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old ally and rival who he had defeated in the Civil War. Ancient sources found that detail almost too symbolic to be real. And where was Brutus during those 23 stab wounds? He struck too. He had to. His participation was the entire point of his involvement from the conspiracy's perspective. The wound Brutus inflicted has been debated for centuries. Some ancient sources suggest it was the wound to Caesar's groin, one of the most painful and intimate of the strikes. Whether Caesar saw Brutus among the attackers and what expression crossed his face in that moment is something history cannot recover. The Shakespeare line, "Et tu, Brute," is invention. But the idea behind it, that Caesar's final recognition was of the one face he never expected to see, has persisted for 2,000 years because it feels psychologically true even if it is historically unverifiable. When it was over, the conspirators had planned to carry Caesar's body to the Tiber River and throw it in, to seize his assets, to immediately pass legislation declaring the restoration of the Republic. Instead, every single one of them panicked. They ran. They scattered through the streets of Rome with blood on their togas while the rest of the city looked on in stunned silence. The theatrical liberation of Rome they had imagined looked, from the outside, exactly like murder. Here is where the conspiracy collapsed completely. And here is where Brutus's philosophical blindness became a historical catastrophe. The conspirators had killed Caesar. They had not made any plan whatsoever for what happened next. They had assumed the Republic would simply reassert itself once the dictator was removed, the way a river resumes its course once a dam is destroyed. They were wrong in a way that changed the entire trajectory of Western civilization. Mark Antony moved immediately. He was Caesar's closest ally and a brilliant political operator who understood in hours what the conspirators had not understood in months of planning. He went to Caesar's house and secured two things: Caesar's personal papers and Caesar's money. The papers gave him knowledge of every political deal, every promise, every secret Caesar had made. The money gave him the ability to act. Then he negotiated with the conspirators for the right to give Caesar a public funeral. Brutus agreed, over Cassius's strong objection. It was the second catastrophic miscalculation of Brutus's life. Antony's funeral speech for Caesar is one of the most devastating pieces of political rhetoric in human history. He did not attack the conspirators directly. He was too clever for that. He read Caesar's will publicly. It left money and land to ordinary Roman citizens, framing Caesar as the people's champion to the end. He displayed Caesar's bloodied toga to the crowd. He described each wound. By the time Antony was finished, the crowd in the forum was not mourning quietly. They were rioting. They tore apart the city looking for the conspirators. They burned the building where Caesar was killed. They drove Brutus and Cassius out of Rome entirely. The republic that Brutus had killed Caesar to save did not return. What followed was years of brutal civil war between Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian on one side and Brutus and Cassius on the other. 2 years after the assassination, at the Battle of Philippi in northern Greece, the Republican forces were defeated. Cassius, believing the battle was already lost when it actually was not, killed himself. Brutus fought a second engagement days later, lost, and then fell on his sword rather than be captured. He died in the field, in the dark, at the age of approximately 42. Mark Antony reportedly found Brutus's body and covered it with his most expensive cloak as a gesture of respect. Even the man who had defeated him acknowledged that Brutus had been, in his own way, genuine. Antony's famous words about Brutus, preserved through Plutarch, essentially absolved him of personal malice, suggesting that while all the other conspirators acted from jealousy and ambition, Brutus acted from an honest belief that he was doing what was right. History's verdict on Brutus has never fully settled. Shakespeare made him the tragic hero. Dante put him in the deepest circle of hell alongside Judas Iscariot. The debate has never stopped because the question at the heart of it has never been resolved. Was Brutus right? That is the question that has haunted this story for 2,000 years. He killed the man who saved his life, trusted him completely, showed him nothing but generosity and warmth, because he believed Rome's freedom mattered more than personal loyalty. He made a decision rooted in genuine philosophical conviction, not ambition, not jealousy, not personal grievance. And the outcome of that decision was the permanent end of the Roman Republic, decades of brutal civil war, and the establishment of the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar, exactly the monarchical system Brutus had killed to prevent. The Republic died on the Ides of March, not because Caesar lived too long, but because Brutus killed him. The assassination did not save Roman democracy. It ended it. Every emperor who came after, every Caesar from Augustus to the fall of Rome 5 centuries later, ruled in the political vacuum that Brutus created when he pulled out his knife in the Theatre of Pompey. And yet, Brutus made his decision the way a genuinely moral person makes an impossible decision, by choosing principle over comfort, by choosing what he believed was right over what was personally safe and personally grateful. He was wrong about the consequences. He was wrong about what the Roman people wanted. He was wrong about almost everything practical. But he was not wrong about what he valued. And in the end, the tragedy of Brutus is not that he was a bad man who did a terrible thing. It is that he was a good man who did a terrible thing for reasons he genuinely believed were right. History is full of villains. Brutus is something rarer and more haunting. He is a good man who changed the world catastrophically by trying to save it.